Hello, today is Friday, April 5th, 2019. This is the SIG Testing Commons subproject meeting. Why don't I share my screen and we can walk through the agenda. It's a kind of a light agenda, but I kind of wanted to walk through code today. So to give folks an idea, because I know last time we struggled to figure out where to tease apart things, and I have a plan for how to attack this. So I've spent a good chunk of my morning walking through some of the code and want to use an example we can walk through. All right, so hopefully folks can see my screen. Let's walk through the first one here. Lubomir, you talked about splitting out a package from kubeadm and potentially putting it in a different location.
Yeah, we briefly spoke with Dims and Ben about this. We need some sort of a new quote-unquote dumping ground for a bunch of tools. One of them is the system validators that we have in kubeadm, because also the Node framework, I believe, oh no, it wasn't the Node framework. Something else is using them in the test folder in KK.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to split this, I think. And also Ben suggested that we have also the Tarbau extractor as something that we can move to there as well.
So there already was a separate repository for common things that we could use as a staging ground, but it'd have to like live underneath staging to get vendored in properly. I don't know.
Are you talking about utils?
They're kind of utils. They're kind of, these ones are very specific. They are utilities. The fact that these utilities live under command.
Sorry, I meant the utils repo. Like there's an external utils repo, and I was wondering why we wouldn't use that instead of creating a testing utils repo.
Yeah, hi, Andrew.
Hey.
Hey, Tim.
Yeah.
So the reasoning was that this was not something that was needed. Well, the K8s.io/utils was more towards people who we don't know who might need that kind of thing, those kinds of things. This seems very specific to testing or validation when kubeadm comes up. So I thought it would make sense to, we anyway need a grab bag for other testing stuff based on what comes out from here, right? From this subgroup.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
I don't know about some of these validators. There already is a separate structure underneath the testing directory. So if you look over here and you look at test, there are separate utilities. If they are true, this isn't just testing though. That's the part that kind of drives me a little bit nutty, is they're validation utilities. So they would be more generic and they'd live on a host. They're not just for testing.
I can give some historical context on these validators. So I believe RandomLu from Google created them first, and they resided in the Node end-to-end tests. At some point, they deleted all the tests that were using these validators. So we moved the validators into kubeadm because kubeadm started using them as pre-flight checks.
Yes.
But then at some point, somebody decided to to import cmd/kubeadm for, I believe, the kernel checks or the Docker checks specifically. So they are used in multiple locations.
Right, and the other issue I have with this package is it vendors in things like Docker, which we are trying to get rid of. So if we end up pulling in additional imports, who knows what it will drag stuff. For example, if you have a validator that uses CAdvisor import, right now I don't think there is one, but then that will turn around and call a whole bunch of other cloud provider stuff.
Right, and for the generic utils repo, there's kind of this assumption that we shouldn't have any external dependencies there, right?
Right. Okay. At least minimize the external dependencies to things that are absolutely needed.
Well, I think if we cleaned it up, it makes sense to have a host validation or node validation or pre-flight, host pre-flight, or whatever you want to call it. It's not specific to test. And putting it under a package util makes a heck of a lot more sense than putting it into a separate SIGs testing utility repository, because it's used by both kubeadm and tests.
Right, but that's valid too. But then I wanted to ask the larger question: are we going to do anything about moving kubeadm out at some point?
Not now, not anytime soon.
I know, but I keep raising that point.
So here are my conditions. Here are my terms to surrender. My terms to surrender are fully validated and V1 component config. If we have that, I don't care, because if we have V1 component config, we can move kubeadm totally out of core, and we won't have to mess with this stuff. That and test automation and apparatus and release versioning automation. So if the working group for infra exists and has the ability to publish artifacts in a seamless fashion for us to be able to publish as an external entity, and if component config is V1, then I will absolutely move out of core and I won't care.
Okay, we should log this in an issue or something.
Yeah.
What you just said, the like 3-4 points.
Yeah, but because that means we're decoupled, right? That means that the versioning, the dependencies that kubeadm really needs, that would take a while for it to, any machination would have to percolate across, right?
Right. Yeah.
The coupling from the Kubernetes release is probably going to be the biggest mistake we can make.
Yeah, I would think that'd be a terrible idea for kubeadm. To be honest, I think the decoupling of repositories in the current incantation, and I've talked to Clayton about this many times. I think it's the worst of all worlds, what we've currently created with the staging repository. Clayton loves it. I think it's an abomination unto God.
Yeah. So why do we include Docker in the validators? I haven't looked. Maybe we don't need it. Maybe we can mock some structures or something.
It uses the Docker client and makes an actual call.
For what? Because I know we use Docker info, but that's the CLI call. Let me open it locally as well.
All right, so I'm going to kind of table this conversation for folks to, I think the path is clear. What we want to do is move the validators under utils and minimize, if we have specific validators that are not used across hosts, try to make them more generic and try to push them into the utils and call it like a host validation or node validation or something of that nature.
So can we move it to package something?
Yeah.
I mean, for now.
I think in order for us to move to package util, node / we should minimize the depths if we're going to do that.
So back to the topic of this group, like, should we strive to decouple from these validators in the framework? Like how we are solving the problem for kubeadm, but how do we decouple the framework from this? Like,
let me get to like one thing in the framework at a time. I have a thought process I want to walk folks through.
Okay.
So before I get into sort of evaluating this umbrella issue, because we talked about it a little bit, I want to talk, because last time I had as an action item for me to come up with a sort of a model. And what the hell is that? whatever. Somebody want to copy that link? I'm just going to open it. Do this. All right, so let me stop sharing the screen. Let me share a different screen. Can folks see this, or should I increase font size or something?
It's pretty good to me.
All right, so the long and the short, our objective is to minimize the depth graph of Framework and make Framework be importable by other things. And ideally, it would become another aspect of staging to make it easier for other people to import, right? So that way we can create plugins, we can create different conformance suites that are out of core, right? That's the high level objective of what we want to accomplish. So the question is where to start, right? Because the framework is like this monolith, right? And when you look at the monolith, you're like, it's very difficult to ascertain what is actually being used. And we started down this road by doing step one, which was like using the external client versus the internal client. And Andrew and Lubomir, mostly Andrew, started to tease that apart, right? And that's good work because that minimizes the dependencies. If you use the internal client, what you do is you drag in all of Kubernetes, right? The external client is well factored to minimize the dependencies, so it can be outside. The internal client is just like a buckyball. You touch one thing, you touch all of Kubernetes. The import is just a tree of everything. All right, so then you look at the framework. That's one thing that we know for certain we can do. All right, that's great. Now that's almost done. What is the next thing we do? How do we decouple this in a systematic way? And the answer that I've come up with for the time being is to do it one by one in the very painful auditing process. Right? So let's do a specific example. Underneath the framework directory, there is a ton of things called util, right? And it doesn't make any sense, right? We basically bundled all of these things underneath one large utility, right? And if you go back underneath package utils, you find that things are way well factored into individual sub-things for the specific domain that it matters, right? So there's no easy answer here. The answer for this is don't trust anything you've seen inside of the framework as de facto. So if you look at something like authorizer util, this is where I started. And then you kind of have to start to tease things apart. You have to figure out where the dependencies for authorizer util are being used. And most of the stuff for authorizer util is being used by the auth package, right? It's not being used by most other things. Some of these things are kind of general purpose. So the answer is you have to use a lot of discretion and you have to do a lot of thinking about where the dependencies exist. But you also have to question the heck out of what is currently there. Some of this kind of makes sense. These are just general purpose utilities. But the thing that struck me as interesting was this one, right? And this is a question for the group. Originally, we didn't have RBAC enabled by default. RBAC is enabled by default. Should we just remove stuff like this and the entire dependency from the tree and basically say, if you don't have RBAC enabled, you just fail? Because we don't want to enable the test apparatus for all of the incantations where RBAC is not enabled. Now, that's an opinionated thing that we need to take a stance on. So what do folks think there for something like this?
Well, I mean, are there other ways to do authorization out of band from Kubernetes that don't involve RBAC at all? I've worked a little less in that space. It just...
You can. I mean, the super old school way for doing stuff like this is you basically put Apache on the front end, and Apache is your entire inbound authorization tool. But if that becomes a little weird because the granularity of access control, it gets lost and you have to basically redo RBAC. So the answer is possible, yes. Is it practical? No way.
Okay, so to do all the like auth plugins or identity providers, like all that still leverages RBAC and requires RBAC, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we can remove this, but if it works as is, we can keep it and focus on the rest of the refactor. I have, for instance, I have a problem where the framework imports stuff from the parent directory.
Yeah, that shouldn't be doing that. But the whole purpose of doing the audit and walking through this way is that I want people to question everything that's there, right? And like, if you look out here, is RBAC enabled? What are the actual call sites for this? And the answer is it's all basically auth related utilities, right? Is RBAC enabled? Is RBAC enabled? It's all in the auth. So you'd have to basically trim this down, eliminate this call site, eliminate the dependencies of the call site, and push some of these utilities into a framework auth directory. That was one way for us to sort of get things into place. So look at the util packages, evaluate whether or not it even makes sense for these things to exist inside a framework. The answer unequivocally in my mind for most of them is no. They should be underneath their own separate directory or hierarchical directory, where if we had util and then we had auth, a lot like package auth, right? And then we could actually sit down here and we could even debate whether or not some of these things should go, some of these utilities should go into package auth. Like you'd have to refactor the framework out of this, but there's no reason why you couldn't have a generic passing in a client set and say, is RBAC enabled with the client set, and do the same type of behavior. Instead of these being logs, they could be errors. The audit for this is going to be hard and painstaking because it's just accreted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, every week for the time being, I'm going to kind of assign or volunteer someone. For example, for the authorization utility that exists here, and finding a home to see where it should be split out and whether or not we could put some of the utilities either into the package utility, or if we should split into a separate framework util auth directory and then refactor the auth test to use that. Does someone want to focus on that one for the next time? And we can actually walk through the code together, the changes that they made. So I'm specifically looking at John and Steve.
Yeah, I'm happy to take the auth one. That's fine.
Tim,
Yep.
I'm wondering if it would make sense before doing that to see if we can just do a bunch of git moves of the specific files into to places where they are used.
You can. That's the problem is we're kind of pushing off debt, right? We've pushed off debt forever, and that's like it's a minimalish way of trying to like push the code. But I want to do the hard thing. Like we want to pay down the debt, right? Like,
right. No, like you said, this is going to be an ongoing process, right? The first step is basically what I'm saying. Do this as the first step, and then we should have a rolling list of things to do for sure.
But the utils is like a clean place to start, right? Now, if people want to coordinate the idea of moving the utils into a separate location and then vendoring those things, that mirror kind of the same directory structure as package, that is a reasonable first step to do. I do think you're kind of avoiding the core crux of the problem.
So when you say package util, do you mean the KK package util, or is there a package util under test?
There is not a package. There is a package util underneath test, but some of this stuff I would still stick underneath framework. So it'd be framework, util, and then there'd be like auth. Some of this stuff I question, like is RBAC enabled? If you modify this call, there is no reason that this can't be generic enough to be in package util and used there. The only reason why this even or question why we even need it at all, right?
Okay. So what I what I would request is don't move things to Kubernetes package util unless it really needs to be there.
Yes, that
You said
I
don't
would-
put it under test util. Is that what you said?
package.
Yeah,
package util.
test util is fine, but don't move things from the test framework into the main package util. Then it's going to be even worse for later.
Okay.
I personally don't think you need this because I think if RBAC is not enabled, we should just bail. That's my opinion. But I think the interim thing is the evaluation process makes sense, right? Create a framework util, and then you could break it out to be like a mirror of some of these things like auth, framework util auth. And then step one would be to push this stuff in there and update the call sites. Step two would be evaluation of what you need to do. I would say like you should do 1 and 2 together and just do it on each util at a time and do the hard work up front, because otherwise you're going to have to do 2 PRs. And then you can start doing that with every single one of these utils that exist underneath the main directory. And as you start to do this, you will find that you are refactoring along the way. And it's a very clean way for us to get one step further in this pipeline.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. The only other thing I would say is try adding the import boss and things like that to make sure that we are paying down the debt in the right direction.
Do you want to have a
I have a question. Is there like one clear and discrete metric we can use to decide like, are we making forward progress? Like import the framework and just count the lines of code? Is that kind of the bar? If importing the framework imports less and less stuff, that's synonymous with us making progress?
That's a general move in the right direction, yes.
Okay. I just want to have some objective thing to be able to use.
The way I do it is I compile the suite binary, I look at the size, and also I use goal list to see the number of dependencies dropping.
Does what I said make sense? It's a hard thing to do. I'm not asking for an easy thing. I'm asking to actually do the hard work of refactoring and start with the utils. Like, do you want a buddy there, John? To someone to walk through it with you? Then we can actually evaluate what happened, what you found.
I mean, I can. I feel like I definitely can start on my own and take a look at it. Sorry. Yeah, I think for a little while, just because I'm not familiar with any particular file we choose out of there, some time just to poke around and tinker and look at all the connections would be useful.
Yeah, I think the utils are better than actually trying to decouple portions of the framework as far as refactoring goes, because the call sites will be pretty synonymous with its function, right? Like PV util, obviously that's used by storage, right? But it might be used by a couple of other call sites. So where can we put it in a place that makes the most sense? And when you actually look at the PV util, you can evaluate and do the hard refactor. Does this structure of these utilities make sense? Now, the PV util has been a lot cleaner than the other ones. Another thing I would do along the way when you're doing this, so one thing we might want to do is like start to create criteria of what we mean by refactoring. For example, like I would consider this to be a no-no. Right? Direct framework style logging inside of here, I would just make it an error, right? Return actual well-defined errors, so that the call sites have to then use the logging inside of the tests themselves, right? Versus actually logging, in this utility library. I generally try to avoid that in any utility.
Yeah, I think tackling the dependency or tackling the code that is directly constrained to under the test directory is a really good strategy to start with, because with the cloud providers, what we did was we just dumped all the internal imports and told people to like assign themselves to it. And what we found was that like trying to remove an internal import led to a bunch of other code that was used in a bunch of other places, which kind of slowed us down a lot, because like we had to refactor some random code in like some other package. So starting with like just code that is only constrained to the test directory, I think is a good start.
I wanted to ask, should we fail like the framework as a whole if our RBAC is not enabled, like from the get-go?
That was the question I had. I personally believe yes.
Should we ask Sigal about this?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing to do. Who wants to do that?
I mean, I can. This means that we can remove all the code sites and leave it to one at the beginning of the framework, once we have a client.
All right, so that's my current strategy of thinking. Are there other folks who want to maybe tackle a couple of the other ones? Like there's deployment utility. I would avoid flake reporting, but there's other things too inside of here that are underneath the utilities that make sense to just break out into their own location. Are there other folks who want to volunteer for this work?
Should we maybe create a checklist in the umbrella issue and then just have people take them themselves?
Someone want to walk through and create the checklist, or should that be on me?
I could do that.
All right, so I wanted to go back to the umbrella issue then. Let me see if I can stop sharing this screen. Share the screen. Let's take a look at what we originally wrote and see where we kind of made progress and where, given findings of taking a look at things, what makes the most sense to do next. So the biggest one here was the primary thing. We started with the internal client. I know that Andrew did a lot of work there and Loomer helped out too. Ownership problems, who actively maintains the tests in the SIG. I do know that we have a label update for end-to-end testing framework. So I was going to walk through the pull requests at the end of what currently exists in the PRs. Providers need external vendoring. I think part of what we're doing here, part of this breaking apart, maybe we should have a separate umbrella issue, which is the breaking apart the utilities and then link to this parent issue.
I can create the ticket for the utils.
Oh, Andrew already volunteered for that.
Oh, okay.
Framework uses non-incremental linking. This is no way to change this. Not without us like extracting out the details. So I think we have a good start. I think this once we create this checklist, that's going to be a lot of work items to decouple. We can federate that out. And there's a lot of utils, and there's even more there, which I kind of question. Like this, I don't think this should be here. I think there's a bunch of things in framework that should not be in framework. And we might just want to shuffle out. So like the KubeMark resource usage, that's super specific to one style of test. And there's the Google Compute one that just screams that it should not be in the generic framework.
KubeMark is also a provider in the framework.
Okay, yeah. I think one of the things I need to do as an action item rationalize what provider actually means. All right. So where did that? All right. Next up that I had, now I'll pause here for a second. Do folks have questions, comments, complaints, concerns? Thoughts on this? Good idea, bad idea? Good strategy, bad strategy?
I think it's good.
All right. The next step was to like review some of the pull requests that were open and kind of rally us on the some of the ideas when we go through reviews. So currently there is a label that's being applied to anything that falls underneath this directory now. Didn't used to happen. Where's the owner's file? I don't see it anymore. Anyways, I'd have to, it's escaping me. I have to take a look, but there's a E2E test framework label that gets applied to anything that lives underneath the framework. So we can use that to sort of query periodically in this meeting, review any backlog items that need to be modified. So why don't we just walk through a couple of these and also see if other people want to be assigned to do the review. So let me close this other stuff. Bang, kabang, kabang. Keep that open. Clean up math ran package. This has been open for a long time. It doesn't look like it needs a rebase. It seems really weird to me. This touches the framework in a weird way. This isn't purely framework, so I'm going to punt on that one. So another key thing to look at too is if it's got a bunch of other labels, we surely shouldn't address those specific ones. Avoid mandatory command line flags. So I struggle with, there's a higher level work item that we didn't have in the umbrella, which is input configuration file handling. It's not actually listed here, I don't think. And it's a mess.
Didn't we have an item? Component standard, I see it as a P2 at the bottom. Use the work from, is this the same?
Yeah, that is the same. So that's the P2 one. I don't know if this fixes 7559. 1 second here. Let's take a look at this issue. E2E and mandatory command line flags. Move flag definitions from a function into a framework to register common flags into an init section of some packages. God, that's awful. That just bristles me the wrong way. that's okay for the Kubernetes end-to-end test suite where the flags traditionally coupled, but now Jessica pointed out that the usage of the test doesn't want the configuration to just show up in the command line. What?
Basically, David requested that Patrick removes some flags from the command line, and it's related to the Viper config in a way that I don't understand. But there was a long discussion between the two. It's Patrick is becoming a maintainer of the flags, and nobody else wants to touch them, and nobody else understands them. But looking at the diff, I think he's doing the right thing.
Yeah, but the question is like, it's one of those things where we're kind of pushing stuff around and not necessarily solving the problem. Like the way we currently handled flags in the end-to-end testing framework was only because we didn't have a good solution. And because component config never existed. Like we didn't have versioned ways of handling, configuration for the test suite.
Yes. So the flags are going to be a big problem, and we are going to break users like we broke David in this case. And I had a question, like a kube test in test infra became so broken that instead of trying to fix it, they decided to make kube test 2. Do you think it makes sense for us to simply call this suite number 1 and create a suite number 2 that has the flag handling properly eventually?
I think you can create the configuration for V2 in a totally separate directory and build it up to the point where it is functional, and then tear all this stuff out. This particular one, I don't even know if I want to. I'll evaluate this one unless somebody else wants to take a look at it. It is really weird. It's not something that I really want to change or even want to address. It's a deficiency that I'd rather look at the hard way and the correct way of solving the problem. Because all it's kind of doing is shuffling things around. I'll take a deeper look at this one. Fix GoLint failures for HTTP framework.
We have a lot of these. Basically, Omichi and some other folks are sending PRs, and I'm just LGTMing them. They are straight GoLint cleanups.
GoLint, though, can give you erroneous stuff like this, the dot packaging. That doesn't really matter because that is standard Ginkgo.
So in terms of object code, does it make a difference of if we are using dot imports or not?
Nope.
Well, in that case, we should probably comply with the linter. By the way, they are doing this in every PR. They are doing it everywhere, like removing the dot imports.
That seems totally reasonable. This is a kind of a non, I don't know, stuff like that, like the FixGo ones. If they're already LGTM, here's one that needs a review. Does someone else want to, besides you, Lubomir, because you've already been on 1 million reviews, does somebody else in the group want to take a stab at reviewing this one and consult with Lubomir?
I mean, the GoLint fixes are pretty easy. Basically, they are mostly adding comments on top of the functions. So we face the lack of approval from time to time because we only have control over the framework, but not over the tests. If the linting fixes are fixing tests as well.
Well, I think one of the ways we do that is just by actually, I think by making these modifications in the utils directory, we build enough street cred and we don't break the universe along the time. We build enough street cred for us to actually get into the approvers files over time.
Yes, sounds good. Can you show the state of this PR at the bottom? Like, I'm not sure why I didn't LGTM it. Yeah, I see. So it's ready to merge.
I'm going to interesting API server matrix.
Making functions private, comments, stuff like that.
That's another thing to evaluate as part of this work over here. Oh, sorry, I'm looking across windows, but you can't see that. As part of the this work here with the utils, evaluate whether or not you can actually make more things private. Let's look at ones that aren't LGTM'd. Are there any ones that aren't? No, they all are. Refactor nodes E2E test. This one is not assigned, or
yeah, it's from yesterday. I haven't seen it yet.
this is a good one. Somebody want to review this one? And work with somebody else. I don't want you to Lubomir. I want you to work with somebody else. I want you to train someone else.
I'll take it.
John?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to read up on it. It says recreate the node E2E test. I see. It's a test about recreating nodes, not recreating the test. I see. Yep.
So why don't you work with Lubomir, and once you're done with your review, you guys can chat together. But I specifically want to train up more folks on this call, right? So that way they can always be reviewers. The way you get street cred, the way you get approver ACLs, the way you get review ACLs is by making the PRs, doing all the hard work, doing the reviews, right? And then, volunteer for things, and then you will get more rights and privileges. That's the way the community works. Are there other things inside of here that aren't already LGTM'd?
Let's talk about the aggregated stuff if you want. So first of all, I made a mistake originally that the aggregated API server has a couple of clients. One of them is the internal one. The other one is like a standard simple client. And apparently in the framework, we are using the quote unquote simple one. So we are okay with not removing this. But what I did is because only a single test uses it, I moved this to API machinery. You saw what I do, but I'm not sure if the loading of config is okay there.
It's weird. Usually the config is loaded once, but it is also, you put it on the before each, which means that every test inside of this thing will do this. So every test inside of the API machinery will reload the config.
Yes, so where should I put it outside of before each?
Well, the question I had was like, why are we reloading versus doing like a modification? What is special about the aggregator client that's different from the standard set of client sets? Because there's so many different client sets that currently exist. And can we rejig from the client, or do you absolutely need to load from the config? I'd have to take a look to know the difference there.
We in the framework, from my understanding, we don't store the config anywhere after it's loaded. So we basically have to reload it. That's the reason for the load. But the creation of the client set itself, to my understanding, the API machinery test is testing a very old version of Kubernetes, like something like 1.10. It's specific to the test, and maybe I should talk with them about this. But that's the only test that is currently consuming this special client, and I don't know the details of like why do we need this even. Maybe just the test is outdated.
Should be able to support 1.10 sample API server using the current aggregator.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a reasonable conformance test. I thought we only supported like 3 minor releases. Is that right? And so 1.11 isn't even out. It's 12, 13, and 14 now?
Yeah. This test is a little weird. And it calls a separate utility to do its testing.
I can create a tracking issue and I assign the right people to triage, like to basically look at this if the test is even up to date.
Yeah, this one's weird in a couple different ways. The config loading randomly on before each I would avoid. I would try to do. There are separate utilities inside of API machinery and the client tooling that allow you to get different clients from a parent client. So what's the difference between an aggregator client and the initial client set that you got from load?
I think it's basically something is aggregated, something is modified. I have no idea.
Can you scroll down a little bit, Tim? I was trying to see where the aggregator client was used and to see if that would give context. I'm assuming it probably just comes with like the dynamic client or something.
Yeah, that's the question is like, we have 2 clients currently inside of the framework. We have the external client set and we also have the dynamic client. But now we have, there always existed this aggregator client too as well. And the question that I'm having is like, why do you need this?
I think the best course of action is to create a ticket in KK and ping API machinery to respond.
Okay. And then link to this issue.
Yeah, it's also important because this is a conformance test.
Yeah. It's already on hold, so we'll leave it there.
Okay.
So I think we have more than enough items. I think once Andrew creates the checklist from the current and links it to the main parent for the utilities, that's a lot of work items to federate out on. Are there folks that want to volunteer for this work besides John, who wanted to work on the first one?
I would like to give it a try.
Okay, George.
Mm-hmm.
Are you in the Testing Commons channel, George?
Yes, I am.
Anyone else? Bueller. Right. All right, so let's create the issue and start to break down some of the work items if you want to volunteer for them. Otherwise, I'll volunteer some of you to work on them. Also, Lubomir, I want to help build everybody else up. So we got 6, 7 people on the call. So let's try to get folks into the engaged and start to help them review and mentor them up to be active participants. So let's get them up to speed.
Yes, this was going to help reduce my working day to less than 16 hours.
Yes, that's the goal. Right. So I think we have a reasonable plan of action for the next couple of weeks. Are there any questions, comments, complaints, concerns, or other topics folks want to talk about?
Well, we can always talk about the providers in the framework and how we're going to do it, but I don't think we have enough time today. It's near the hour.
I think baby steps here. Like let's decouple, and then get to the point where we're actually talking seriously about provider integration. So
One thing that's somewhat fresh on my mind, just because we ran across it with the Sonobui air gap stuff, I'm not sure if it's appropriate for the testing commons, but it's how those testing images are used and selected. I'm not sure if there might even already be a ticket about like wanting to reduce the number or size of those images. Because like when you back up and say like, hey, if I want to run testing in air gap, that requires like 70 gigs of images. And in a lot of cases, I looked at the tests and they're using, you know, multiple versions of Nginx really when they could use any dummy image. And there's a bunch of other ones that are, again, inflated 10, 20, 30 megabytes when really they're just trying to like push something, see that the image name changes, so on and so forth. I'm wondering if there's ever been a endeavor to track where and why we're using all these different images. We have like 72 images when, you know, maybe 5 would work.
You and your logic and reasoning. I'd rather be guided by my feelings.
Yeah. At the last place I worked, what we did when we had all these like testing things was you even just created like a special testing image so that you didn't have to have like a special echo image and a special this image. And it's just you had one image and you said like, this runs a server and it can run these like 5 endpoints that a few different tests will use, and it at least centralized to know like
I think
what you use, why you use it.
Yeah, deduping is a good effort, and I think you should open, if there's not an issue open already, which there probably is somewhere, feel free to open it, and if you want to work on it, then we can go ahead.
Okay.
But yes, it would fall underneath this umbrella because this is basically refactoring the framework and reducing the dependencies. The problem we currently have, though, is that the only way to push a new image is to get a Googler. So we can create a new image and make one Uber test image, which I highly endorse. But we will be blocked until we can like corner XD or some other person who has image push rights from Google.
About that though, I mean, like even that seems sort of strange to me, especially now that there's like 5 different repos or registries where we pull images from. Is there not a way that we can have a registry where other blessed people can do it, or will it just for all time be only Googlers and only Google repos or registries?
Again, this is only because of the current state of where we're at. Like we've wanted to get Google out of the driver's seat for a long time, and they want to be out of the driver's seat. But there's a bunch of ongoing work, what's called the working group, infra working group, which is basically to get Google out of test, release, automation, image management, all the other stuff that is related to this.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So I think deduping into a single test image makes a ton of sense. If you want to add that issue for next week's topics to discuss to see where you're at, I think that'd be a useful way for us to keep making the ball move forwards.
Will do.
Great. So just to recap on items before we split, Andrew said he was going to create the umbrella issue, which is going to have a whole bunch of work items, sync with John and George. Lubomir is not going to try to do less of the things and help train up some of the other folks. And we will follow up on the action items next week. And I think that's everything. Any other last questions, comments, complaints, concerns? Nope. Going once, twice, 3 times. All right. Cool. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.